Saturday, September the 25th, 1982, Shabbat Shuvah. The Sidra this morning traditionally is regarded as a farewell sermon that Moses gave in poetry. Obviously it is a later construction. I thought we would read some of the words with which Moses addresses the Israelites. He doesn't seem to have too much confidence in them, and in a typical biblical fashion he threatens them that when they break God's law, there's no question about if they break God's law. He knows them to be a stiff-necked people and that they will break God's law, and describes what will happen when they do that. How could you have been so stupid, God says to them through the mouth of Moses in this sermon. You thought your successes came because of your own strength. You thought my strength and the power of my hand has wrought all these things for me. But if I hadn't been behind you, which we might translate, if you had not maintained and held to those values which are part and parcel of the tradition of Israel, you wouldn't have been able to accomplish what you did. And once you violate my law, I will withdraw my support from you. I'm going to read from verse 19 on page 899 before turning briefly to the Haftarah. Verse 19 on page 899, the Lord saw and spurned because of the provoking of his sons and his daughters, and he said, I will hide my face from them, I will see what their end shall be. For they are a very froward generation, children in whom there is no faithfulness. They have roused me to jealousy with a no God. They have provoked me with their vanities, and I will rouse them to jealousy with a no people. I will provoke them with a vile nation. For a fire is kindled in my nostril, and burned unto the depths of the netherworld, and devoureth the earth with her produce, and setteth ablaze the foundations of the mountains. The wasting of hunger, and the devouring of the fiery bolt, and bitter destruction. And the teeth of beasts will I send upon them, with the venom of crawling things of the dust. Without shall the sword bereave, and in the chambers terror, slaying both young man and virgin, the suckling with the man of grey hairs. I thought I would make an end of them. I would make their memory cease from among men. Were it not that I dreaded the enemy's provocation, lest their adversaries should misdeem, lest they should say, our hand is exalted, and not the Lord hath wrought all this. For they are a nation void of counsel, and there is no understanding in them. If they were wise, they would understand this. They would discern their latter end. How should one chase 1,000, and two put 10,000 to flight, except their rock had given them over, and the Lord had delivered them up? For their rock is not as our rock, even our enemies themselves being judges. For their vine is of the vine of Sodom and of the fields of Gomorrah. Their grapes are grapes of gall. Their clusters are bitter. Their wine is the venom of serpents, and the cruel poison of asps. Is not this laid up in store with me, sealed up in my treasuries? Vengeance is mine, and recompense against the time when their foot shall slip, for the day of their calamity is at hand, and the things that are to come upon them shall make haste. For the Lord will judge his people, and repent himself for his servants, when he seeth that their stay is gone, and there is none remaining, shut up or left at large. And now turn to the Haftarah, on page 891, the Haftarah specially chosen for this day, the Shabbat between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the Shabbat of the 10 days of penitence, Shabbat Shuvah, which takes its title from the opening word, Shuvah Yisrael, return, O Israel, page 891, return, O Israel, unto the Lord thy God, for thou hast stumbled in thine iniquity. Take with you words, and return unto the Lord, and say unto him, forgive all iniquity, and accept that which is good. So will we render for bullocks the offering of our lips. Ashur shall not save us. We will not ride upon horses, neither will we call any more the work of our hands our gods. Well, if this were a classroom, which it is in a way, after all, a synagogue is bet midrash, is it not? And this is the bima, which is very badly translated as the altar. Bima simply means stage. And behind me, behind that white curtain, much as we treat it with great reverence, is a bookshelf with books. The fact is that the books are written the way books were written a long time ago, on parchment and rolled. But nevertheless, if we Jews worship anything, we worship a book. The sacred text, the Bible, the Torah, narrowly, the 5 books of Moses, that is all that we have in the ark, but by extension also the words of the prophets, without which the 5 books of Moses would be unthinkable, in terms of which the traditions of our fathers were reinterpreted and reconstructed. So I had this fancy, if this were a classroom and I could give you homework, I mean homework that I would have to have you do here. I wouldn't trust you to take it out and talk about it to anybody else. I'd want to see exactly how you do it yourselves. I would like to ask all of you to write a paper right here and now on how you hear these verses. How do you hear these verses? What comes to your mind, for example, when in the Haftarah later on we can't read it all because there isn't time, in verse 20, the prophet says through God, I will remove far from off you the northern one, and will drive him into a land barren and desolate. Who might the prophet be referring to? Then, now, the reason why people reread and reread the Bible is because it is blessed with that delicate obscurity which makes it possible to find diametrically opposed views sustained therein. I haven't had an opportunity to see the recently advertised Reader's Digest version of the Bible. I have a funny suspicion that by taking away the ambiguity, the quite deliberate ambiguity of the biblical text, which challenges the reader to find a meaning and interpretation, the essence of what the biblical tradition is all about will be lost. Now, this is the topic, of course, what all Jews are agonizing over this weekend, and which presumably will also have to be dealt with on some level on the Day of Atonement, is a topic which I really did not want to deal with this morning and managed to avoid dealing with altogether on Rosh Hashanah. And somebody complained. Your chairman received one of his telephone calls, which he no doubt can regale in some celestial place where he holds his next chairmanship position. I understand he won't be giving the same talk next year. Complaining that the rabbi didn't talk about Israel on Rosh Hashanah. It was quite deliberate. Judaism existed before the Begin government, and Judaism will exist long after the Begin government. Judaism existed long before modern Zionism, and Judaism will exist long after modern Zionism, if indeed there is a long after modern Zionism. We are not limited to a land, we never were. We are not limited to politicians, that's for sure, nor even statesmen. We are the people of the prophets. And somehow, in a curious way, words that were written thousands of years ago, that is what struck me most forcefully reading the words from the Torah and the prophets this morning, seem to have a corrosive effect even today on what is going on, which would indicate to me that somehow, since the Jewish people created those words, and since the Jewish people created the God embodied in those words, that we're talking to ourselves. This is us. This is our story. We would do well to try to understand the kind of people we are if we want to understand what's going on right now. And so the injunction of the Musaf of Rosh Hashanah that we remember, we put it that God should remember, but since we created that God, what it really means is that the highest common factor of the Jewish people, the ideal aspiration of the Jewish people, that part of the Jewish people which we aspire to be that which is most representative, most noble about us, should be aware of where we came from, what we have been through, and where we are going. Now, the danger of even talking about this topic except in the kind of ambiguous words of the Bible so that you can argue any position and claim that any position was yours is that Jews are torn and divided over this issue as never before. And two, I suppose, radical positions could be held. The totally convinced fundamentalist Zionist will refuse to be shaken by the events of the last week. Some explanation will be given. Some rationalization will be created to justify, if not condone, what happened. That's on one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, we have those who have never been comfortable with Zionism, genuine, authentic critics of Zionism, anti-Semites, both Jewish and non-Jewish, and they will seize upon the events of the last week in order to say, gotcha. In other words, we've been saying all along that this was not going to lead anywhere good. We've been saying all along that once Israel became like any other nation, we would degenerate like all other nations. And now, gotcha. You see, Israel is just like anybody else. I don't know how this polarity is represented in this congregation this morning, but the evidence, as I can see it, is quite clear that Jews are reacting in confused and diametrically opposed ways to what has happened. My views on this topic to those members of the congregation who have been visiting this synagogue for the last 20 years since I have been here are well known. We do have a large proportion of visitors here this morning. And on the Day of Atonement and Kol Nidre, we will have people here who have not been attending regularly during the year, in a sense a captive audience. I would like to play the part of the advocate of the devil for a brief moment. I would like to defend Begin and Sharon for what happened. And I can do it quite easily. I hope by mentioning it, it's not going to happen, but thus far, although I've lived in New York City for 20 years, I haven't been mugged yet. Every member of my family has. Perhaps rabbis lead charmed lives. What am I talking about? There was a minister who had 3 bullets in him in, what's that posh place I keep on forgetting? Yes, well, that's what happens when you live in Bedford. It's the second murder they've had. It's very respectable murders. You know, the usual thing, violins, clarinets being stolen, pocket money being ripped off, traveling money, tokens, handbags snatched. But I've often had fantasies. This is not the best part of myself. I wouldn't like you to think of what I'm going to say now, that this represents the quintessential Miller. It really doesn't. It's a part that I'm ashamed of. It's the part that got me standing to my feet cheering during both movies in which Charles Bronson featured, called... I just want to see whether you're awake this morning. And my closest friends were disgusted with me, and rightly so. They told me that that movie was a vigilante movie. They told me that just because my wife had been murdered and my daughter raped, which is, I gather, what the storyline of that first movie was, that doesn't mean that I should take the law into my own hands, especially a law which apparently lets at least 50% of the muggers not even be discovered, and another 25% go scot-free because of some legal technicality. If I'm wrong about these statistics, please correct me. I understood what that man was about, because deep down inside me is a vigilante. I try to keep it down. It comes out in the night in dreams. I could have taken hold of somebody who had done anything like that to my kith and kin and sunk my teeth in their throat and killed them on the spot. And what is more, if I'd had the opportunity to throw a gasoline bomb through their window and wipe out innocent members of their family at the same time, so what? Scum goes to scum. In my fantasies, which are not the best part of me, they are not the civilized part of me, they are the barbaric part of me, the part of me which the thin veneer of civilization, which I did not create, but which comes to me by virtue of the fact that I happen to be born in the 20th century, endeavors to keep below wraps, but honesty tells me that it's there. And if I had known of a child or a wife or a parent massacred at Ma'alot or at Munich or at any of those occasions over the past 20 years or so when the PLO have shown scant respect for the life and limb of men, innocent men, women as children, as innocent as any that were in those camps, I would have been totally impervious to whether my vendetta, my vengeance, the vengeance that the prophet speaks of this morning, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, whether other innocents were wiped out in the process. There's no such thing as getting vengeance without wiping other people out too. We all know that. We all know that during the Second World War, we bombed men, women, and children who had nothing to do with the war because we wanted to demoralize the enemy. Any number of movies and plays and novels deal with this theme. We all know that. I just wanted to start by being the advocate of the devil. I could put forward a perfectly valid claim that what Sharon and Begin did, because I believe that on some level they did know about it, long before they said they did. And in fact, the thing that pains me most this week is that that full-page ad which the Israeli government took out was so ill-advised. I do hope it wasn't paid for by UJA money. I do hope it was.
It was not.
Thank God for that. It was such an idiotic statement. First of all, as they say in Yiddish, qui s'excuse s'accuse. This is a Lithuanian Yiddish, so I have to translate it. He who excuses himself invariably accuses himself. And the front page of the Times bore witness that there were Israeli army officers who, by name, their names were mentioned, said that they knew 36 hours before it happened that it was going to happen. So why did the government, what kind of people does the government of Israel think we are that we will buy these handouts anymore? This idiotic propaganda which I don't believe anymore. I've got to the stage when I no longer believe the government of the State of Israel. I do not believe the statements of the government of Israel. I do not believe the statements of its representatives, from Mr. Bloom at the United Nations, from its ambassadors in Washington and New York, or rather I should say I believe them as I believe any ambassadors and diplomats. They're all a bunch of liars. And I hate to say that the Israeli government turned into a liar this week. And as the evidence comes forward, we will see how much of a lie it was when it knew what was going on. Now, having said that, I'm going to ask all of us to hold our judgment, at least temporarily. I believe, and I hope, and I pray that Mr. Begin will come to his senses, and if he doesn't, the people of Israel and the Jewish people world over will make him come to his senses and insist that an absolutely neutral, objective, independent commission of inquiry be set up with full power to get documents, with full power to subpoena, with full power to get every last vestige of information that is needed to ascertain and understand what went wrong. And until such time, we Jews should talk to ourselves and to no others. We have a tradition in democracy that a man is innocent until he is proven guilty. And since the newspapers have shown scant respect for truth, since world public opinion showed scant respect for the actual extent of what was going on in Lebanon, since a current of anti-Semitism fanned and inflamed and exaggerated beyond any reasonable condition what actually was done, so that there was once a time when there were more casualties inflicted by the Israelis than people who actually lived in Lebanon, I think we would all do well to hold our horses and wait until such a commission is set up, and that if it isn't, we should start sending letters to the ambassadors of Israel and to the leaders of Israel, and having marches and having protests. I don't think the time is ripe yet. I think we have to give the leaders of Israel a chance for the reactions of the world to soak in. I think it's premature to start rushing in and making judgments where nobody really knows what actually happened. However, in being the advocate of the devil, I am saying that if I had had somebody destroyed by the PLO, and I had had an opportunity to have surrounded a camp where I knew that there were members of the PLO, because apparently, again, this has to be demonstrated, although it seems highly reasonable, at least 2,000 PLO were left in Lebanon with their weapons, and The reason why the Israelis stayed behind was to get rid of those people. And the reason why they allowed the phalangists in the camps was because the PLO are known to hide behind innocent men, women, and children. And some of those people who connived or looked at or turned their backs on what happened, and incidentally to say that we didn't do it, the phalangists did, is the worst argument possible. In our Bible, in the 12th chapter of the first book of Kings, when King David spies Bathsheba on the top of a roof bathing and takes a fancy to her and learns that she is married to Uriah the Hittite and calls in Joab, the commander of his army, and says, I want Joab gotten rid of, send him to the hottest part of the front. And Joab is sent to the hottest part of the front so that he can be killed, so that David can marry Bathsheba. When Nathan the prophet comes to David to confront him, he doesn't say, God is angry with you because Joab killed Uriah the Hittite. He says, you killed Uriah the Hittite. If indeed innocent men, women, and children were murdered in Lebanon, Begin and Sharon killed them as surely as if they had had their hands on the trigger. Let's get with that and stop prevaricating and rationalizing. In Jewish tradition, whether you do it yourself or not is irrelevant. The question is whether you have responsibility and culpability. And anybody who knows the nature of the phalangists and knows the nature of blood feuds in Lebanon and know what has happened in the last 40, 50 years in Lebanon knows that to allow the phalangists into that kind of a situation is like putting a cat into a room where there's a mouse and dissociating oneself from all responsibility for the death of the mouse. It simply is too naive, too inept, and it may wash in advertisements in the New York Times, but it does not wash in our hearts, nor in the hearts, thank God, of a large and growing number of Israelis. And perhaps the most beautiful thing that has come out of this week, and there's no such thing as a tragedy which does not bring forth beauty, one of the strange paradoxes of life which we are more conscious of at this time of the year than any other time of the year, is that out of the most abject suffering, incredible beauty grows in a strange paradoxical way. There is no suffering from which something incredibly marvelous and spiritual does not come forth if we only allow it to happen. We were talking at our dinner table last night. Please don't quote me because my children get crazy if I tell them what we discuss at home. But sometimes the things that happen closest to me are the things I talk about because they're the closest to my heart. My younger son has just started a course in constitutional. If anybody says this to him afterwards, no bar mitzvah next year. And he's very enthused about this constitutional law and wanting to show off that I also took a case of studying constitutional law, and when I was studying in England, I mentioned Marbury versus Madison. And he took off, and we were enriched by an incredibly beautiful description of what Marbury and Madison was all about. And I suddenly realized what this is all about this week. This is about the survival of democracy. The issue this week is whether Jews believe that democracy is something that is valuable. That's what it's about. The issue of whether we're going to have an independent tribunal, whether Israel will deal with its Watergate the way America dealt with its Watergate. That's what it's all about. Is the issue of whether Israel is truly a democracy. The business of Orthodox rabbis controlling religion and not letting people marry who they want to, this is almost subsidiary to what is. That's one of the problems. But it's almost subsidiary to the main problem. The question we ask as we approach Yom Kippur this year is, are we still believers in democracy? Or are we fascists? There's nothing in between. Either you allow an independent, objective investigation of what happened. That's how a democracy functions. Any other method of approach is an attempt to conceal the truth. And the miracle is that in Israel, thousands upon thousands of men and women are speaking up, and among them, those who themselves endured the humiliations of concentration camps, because they saw the affinity between Babi Yar and Auschwitz and what happened in the camps in Lebanon last week. I am an advocate of the devil. I have been a critic of Israel. I find it difficult to criticize Israel this week. I even almost find it difficult to criticize Begin and Sharon, because deep down in me, I recognize something of the primitive barbarism that rises in our throats when we are confronted with a kind of vicious violence represented by the PLO. The vast majority of the Jewish people was not affected. A small number, it would appear, were responsible. A small number. And the process of democracy is beginning to work. I wanted to be an advocate of the devil because the world is seizing on this like on a piece of carrion, like vultures on carrion. The Goyim are having a yontif. When the thug and the brigand and the prostitute do something immoral, nobody takes the blindest bit of interest. But when the Jewish people that constantly prides itself on its ethical values finds that it is capable of something close to what the Nazis did, then everybody feels very superior and virtuous. I do not take my cue from the Gentile world. I am disgusted by their hypocrisy. Where was President Reagan's mouth when worse crimes were being perpetrated in El Salvador, or in Nicaragua, or in any of the Latin American states which we fed and provided and sustained while they were treating their citizens with a callousness and a contempt, torture, maiming, pillaging? Jacobo Timmerman's story should be read in this connection. Where was Channel 13 on that occasion? Where was NBC and ABC and CBS? All those virtuous reporters trying to pin the Israeli representatives down and say, well, you see, you did it, didn't you? How did it happen? When the nuns were murdered, when priests were shot, where were they, all these virtuous Gentiles? But when the Jews get within 1% of doing something like that, everybody suddenly becomes a big tzaddik. I'm not saying that it is right for Jews to do this just to 1%, because everybody else does it. Sharon is an idiot. He said to Perez, what are you complaining about? You did the same thing 2 years ago, as if somehow you can get off the hook. And even the Israelis were speaking on the television last night and the night before. Well, you shouldn't believe the Jerusalem Post, somebody said. The Jerusalem Post printed the cable which clearly indicates that 300 civilians have been killed, a cable which was received by Israeli officers. Israeli soldiers have already spoken to the press and said, we went to the officer and said something has happened, and the officer says, don't worry, it's okay. And what did this Israeli diplomat say? He says, you can't believe the Jerusalem Post, it's an opposition newspaper. As if when the Washington Post published information about Watergate, it should have been discounted, because after all said none, it's an opposition newspaper. In the 20th century, if I were to give you a list of all the people who would be massacred innocently, it would take us 6 months at least. Indochina, Indonesia, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Nicaragua, the Honduras, Latin America, you name it, we've got it. Hundreds, thousands. The boat people, hundreds, thousands. We've read articles, we read books. Nothing ever aroused a comparable reaction except perhaps the Vietnamese War. Why is everybody getting so hysterical? Just because the Jews get involved in it. And in a very minuscule scale. I'm still being the advocate of the devil. And on such a minuscule, yes, of course, as a Jew I know, Kol ha'ma'abed nefesh achat ki'iru kiyem olam malei. V'chol ha'makayem nefesh achat ki'iru kiyem olam malei. Our Jewish tradition tells us that whoever sustains one life, it is as if he sustained the whole world. And whoever kills one human being, it is as if he has destroyed the whole world. I believe in that. But having said it, there is a difference between 303 million and 6 million. Yes, from a strictly religious point of view, one toothache cannot be multiplied by 6 and produce 6 toothaches. When you have reached the limit of the pain that a single human being can endure, you have reached the limit of the theological problem. To add to it is useless. That is why Dostoevsky shrewdly makes the issue of God's righteousness, the whole issue of theodicy, bound up with the tears of a single child. That is the religious position. You can't say that 6 million people burnt to death is worse than one. One single human being burnt to death presents us with a whole theological problem. That's why the book of Job is about one man. It doesn't make it worse if there are 6 million. It just makes it more incomprehensible. We ought to be able to feel as devastated by one innocent as we are by 6 million or 6 billion. But realities are realities. And if it was 300 or 400 or 500, even if Sharon killed them with his bare hands, why is the world screaming? How does this compare to what we did in Vietnam? How does this compare to the callousness with which we have treated just about every single fascist dictator in Southern America for the last 100 years? I heard an item on the news this week. 3,000 cattle prods, each one capable of administering a shock of 3,000 volts, were shipped to South Africa. Just live with this for a moment. I stood still in horror. It was on WNCN, who still permit their newscasters to have some kind of an attitude towards what they say. There was some beautiful sarcasm in the way in which the gentleman who was reading this news item reported it. He said, they do say there was a mistake. We aren't supposed to sell cattle prods capable of administering 3,000 volts of electricity into some human being's behind, black or white. A mistake was made. Somebody didn't read the order. Unfortunately, the news reporter went on, they were already shipped, so we can't do anything about it. And the apology from the State Department, no doubt, will be received with graciousness by those in whose rear ends those prods are used. This is America. This isn't Israel. In God's name, I have protested against the fact that the state of Israel has become the biggest purveyor of weapons to the third world. And in Washington last week, according to the Wall Street Journal, most military visitors were fascinated by one item: the way in which the Israelis got rid of the missiles in the Bekaa Valley. So out of Zion shall go forth the latest hardware sophistication in weapons of destruction. Is that what the prophets prophesied about? Of course it isn't. Of course it isn't, but that isn't the Jewish people. And we will not allow a handful of Jews, Israelis or anybody, to speak for the Jewish people. And that is why I avoided talking about the subject on Rosh Hashanah. I do not take my cue from the Israeli government as to what should or should not be talked about. But this week, the situation has deteriorated. I am in pain. I am in pain. Took the position of being the advocate of the devil, and I could make a good case. I could make a good case if I had to sit in front of any Arab, or any hater of the Jewish people, or any neutral, wishy-washy Jew whose sole contribution to the welfare of the Jewish people is criticism, and doesn't give a penny to UJA Federation or Israel Emergency Fund or support synagogues or American Jewish Congress or Committee of Verband Labor Zionism or anything that's worthwhile in Jewish life. I'm not interested in that kind of response. I'm in pain. Why am I in pain? Because in a sense, Judaism has failed. Yiddishkeit has failed. Not totally. Not totally. A little bit of cancer came back again. We have to have radiation. We need chemotherapy. We may need an operation. For 2,000 years, we didn't possess power. We didn't have Uzi machine guns. We didn't have drone planes. We didn't have ground-to-air missiles. We didn't have the sophisticated weaponry provided by America. We didn't have any of these things. And we created a vision of life. It didn't just start 2,000 years ago. Of course, it began as soon as the ancient prophets realized that we were on our way out as far as the world power was concerned. And at that point, a new song was sung in the chambers of humanity, not by might, not by weapons, not by napalm, not by jet aeroplanes and fighters and bombers, but by my spirit, saith the Lord. And for 2,000 years, the Jews survived on that belief. That belief, of course, went up in smoke in the gas chambers of Auschwitz. To be vulnerable and to be passive meant that anybody could wipe us out. And if I had to choose between Auschwitz and what happened last week, I would have to choose what happened last week. In sorrow, in pity, in fear and trembling. I am in pain because Yiddishkeit failed, only to a small extent. It's as if we were declared free of cancer for 2,000 years. For 2,000 years, whatever else we did, we didn't kill, we didn't maim, we didn't butcher. We davened and we wrote commentaries on the Talmud. And then, by a quirk of fate, a turn of the wheel of history, Jews were enabled to create an army which may be, and I include America and Russia, which may be the best army that has ever existed on the face of the earth. Jewish Kunst and American hardware. The drive of the Jew to survive, wedded to modern weaponry. Above all, the drive, the weaponry, and the myth. I will never forgive Begin. I will never forgive Begin for prattling about Judea and Samaria as if the Bible gives us claim to that land. The Bible does not give us claim to that land. I will never forgive Begin for having prefaced those remarks in the New York Times last week with blood libel. It is obscene to use Jewish mythological terms in an endeavor to pull the mythological wool over people's eyes. That is the greatest deception possible. It was not a blood libel if Israelis were responsible for the massacre of men, women, and children. That's not a blood libel. For that, you need an independent court of inquiry, not hurling accusations of blood libel or anti-Semitism. I am in pain. I am in pain because I thought that the Jewish experiment, the mitzvahs, Shabbos, Yontif, Pesach, Matzah, Charosis, gefilte fish, the whole shtick, had created a fairer kind of human being. Wasn't that what it was all about? A different kind of man. Franz Rosenzweig spoke about all the other nations are still in history. We have left history. We are beyond, we are above history, but it's not true. Last weekend, first signs of a tumor emerged on the body corporate of the Jewish people. We had been clean for 2,000 years, since the destruction of the temple in the year 70. And what we have discovered is that it is one thing to be ethical and impotent. It's another thing to be ethical and potent. And some of our people can't quite make the grade. And so the question we are faced with is, can the Jewish people as a whole rise up and insist that Jewish values must endure? That we draw a sharp distinction between the Israeli people and those whom they elected, in the same way that during the Nixon era we drew a sharp distinction between the Americans and Mr. Nixon. And we hope and pray that Israel will survive its Watergate in the same way that America survived its Watergate. And that we hope and pray that in our reflection and meditation over the next few days, we will ask ourselves, on some level, every Jew has to ask himself, how long am I going to be a good German? The cancer is there. There is no question about it. As of now, I believe it is minuscule. It is cancer, but it is minuscule. It has not yet metastasized. Evidence from world Jewry indicates that even those who have most staunchly defended Zion cannot go along with this outrage. The question now is, can we work as a body politic to exorcise this poison in our midst? It is not the Jewish people, it is its leaders. It is not the state of Israel as a whole. The state of Israel as a whole, I believe, is infinitely superior to its current leaders. I also hope and pray that Begin and Sharon will have the wisdom to resign, because without that, I don't think any possibility will be existing of showing to the world of not how the Gentiles feel. I am not interested in what the Gentiles feel right now. This is a Jewish issue. Somebody drew my attention yesterday to a speech given by Morris Abram, which he says that anti-Semitism is on the rise. I couldn't care less. Anti-Semitism has never been a Jewish problem, and it never will be a Jewish problem. It's a non-Jewish problem. We suffer from it, but there are things that we suffer from about which we can do nothing. If we want to save the Jewish people, we would do better not to worry about sending pamphlets to anti-Semites to try to make them think that we're good people, which they will never believe. I'm reminded right now of the 30s. Different voices, different slogans, different concepts. This is 1933 all over again. I've been here before. Except instead of 3 million unwanted Jews in Poland, there are 3 million unwanted Jews in the Middle East. That is to say, Jews who stand between America and oil and the rest of the world and oil. Been here before. Anybody who was awake and running around in 1933 surely has some sense of the repetition of history. We've been here before. We can't stop people hating us. We can do something about the quality of Jewish life. We can't stop the wind and the rain, those random events. If I believe that the things that Jews do created anti-Semitism, it would be different. I don't think it makes any difference. Our goal over these high holidays is to perfect ourselves. Shuva Yisrael, ad Adonai Elohecha, ki chashalta ba'avonecha. Return, Israel, to the Lord thy God. You have stumbled in your iniquity. It's our responsibility. It's our leaders. We have to clean up the mess. We have to stand up and be numbered. And let us not just criticize. Israel needs even more support than ever before. Well, I'm afraid that those of you who have paid for your tickets on Kol Nidre maybe should go to another synagogue, because if you think I'm going to write another sermon by Kol Nidre, you're mistaken. However, I will just let you into this secret of the, rabbinical office that I was really almost too upset to talk today, but this is Michael's bar mitzvah. I couldn't ignore the issue. Let's call this a prolegomenon to an understanding of where we are at in terms of Jewish survival. And we have a day of fasting and reflection to take the agenda a stage further. We rise for Aleinu on page 194.